All right. First of all, thank you everyone for your patience. We have another full house tonight, which is really excellent to see that there's such a thirst amongst the Frankfurt audience for the works of ABBAS Kiarostami. We'll be watching Close Up, a film that I think is not just one of ABBAS Kiarostami's masterpieces, but really one of the masterpieces of cinema history. And I think it's also very appropriate that tonight we'll be having this film presented to us by none other than Vinzenz Hediger. It's a cliche to say our next guest needs no introduction, but sometimes cliches are true, and I think that our next guest really does not need an introduction, because anyone who has been to one of the lecture and film events over the last 15 years or so will have been touched by the presence of Vinzenz Hediger and his curatorial vision for this series, because he is the founder of this series and the curator and the kind of guiding light of this series for the last 15 years. He started off the series with a retrospective of the works of Jean-Luc Godard, and I think it's very appropriate that we're now kind of taking on ABBAS Kiarostami, because they're also two filmmakers who are in some sense, despite very different national and cultural and chronological contexts, very much kindred spirits, I would say. Vinzenz Hediger is Professor of Film Studies at the Goethe-Universität right here in Frankfurt am Main, a position he has had also for roughly the last 15 years, and he's really been an indomitable presence in the film cultural scene of the city and the region. You really can't underestimate what he's been able to achieve in this time, in terms of not just teaching multiple generations now of students, film studies from bachelor, master's, and PhD level, but also groundbreaking research projects that he's initiated and stewarded, as well as kind of curatorial and institutional partnerships that he has cultivated with pretty much every corner of the film world in Frankfurt, but none more so than with the DFF, which I think Vinzenz has been part of a kind of glue that has joined the TFM department at the Goethe-Universität and the DFF together as kind of very closely collaborating institutions. The sad news is that Vinzenz will be leaving us. He will be heading to a really incredible job as director of the Cinémathèque Suisse in Lausanne in the new year. So we'll be, I think, seeing the birth of this incredible axis between Frankfurt and Lausanne that will, see many projects come to fruition over the coming months, years, decades, perhaps even. But right now, Vinzenz is here to give us his departing lecture as Professor of Film Studies at the Goethe-Universität on ABBAS Kiarostami's film Close Up, but it definitely will not be the last time Vinzenz is here at the DFF to talk cinema with you, the audience. There will be many future occasions on which that will take place. But right now, I want us all to join in giving a very heartfelt round of applause to welcome Vinzenz up to the lectern.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. I can guarantee you, once you've sat through my opening remarks, you will not regret having come here, because you're about to see one of the greatest films in cinema history. It's very moving to be here tonight and to have this as the occasion, to be able to talk about this film as one of my last public speaking engagements in Frankfurt. You could say that I'm going home. You do know that the Swiss invented Heimweh. Nostalgia is a medical term that was coined in the 18th century to describe a illness that was very typical to Swiss soldiers in the service of foreign powers. So it's the pain of return. that nostalgia describes. And it's a Swiss invention, like so many things. But it would be wrong to say that I'm going home, because this has been my home for the last 15 years and it will continue to be so. I do want to point out that Tina Kopf and I, for this occasion, spontaneously dressed up in the same type of sweater. That's a solidarity gesture. We're wearing heavy sweaters because the winter is cold and because right now, I think I can afford to say this, cultural policy in Germany is every bit as stupid as educational policy. What's with the cutbacks, guys? This is a rich country, and you have an opening, you have an opportunity. The British and the Americans are shooting themselves in the foot. All you have to do is open the spigot and let people work in tranquility, and then you'll be the world leader in everything. But no, once again, whoops, the Swabian housewife triumphs. Please remember, state finances and your personal finances have nothing to do with each other. Going into debt is the source of modern statehood. I just want to leave that here. I'm also very touched that Heide Schlüppmann is here. She was my predecessor at film studies. She built film studies at Goethe University of Frankfurt. She's, of course, as you all know, a leading scholar of early cinema. This is a story I keep on quoting. Literally, film studies emerged in Frankfurt out of critical theory. When Adorno died on June 8th, 1969, which incidentally is 2 days before I was born, and he died in Switzerland. When Adorno died, philosophy for many of his students became somewhat boring. And some of them decided to go to the cinema. And I think that's Heide's story. And Heide sort of incarnates the birth of cinema studies in Germany as a critical feminist project out of the spirit of critical theory. My supervisor was also from Frankfurt, my PhD supervisor, Christine Noll-Brinkmann, who built cinema studies at the University of Zurich, starting in 1989, and trained a whole generation of film scholars who are now professors all over the world, some of which are here present. Yvonne Zimmermann, for instance, professor of cinema studies, world-famous film historian, vice president of the University of Marburg at this point. My own wife, Alexandra Schneider, who is a professor of cinema studies at Mainz University, was trained by Christine Noll-Brinkmann. And so even the Swiss here are sort of Frankfurters by training and genealogy. And we're closely affiliated with the spirit of cinema studies as a critical feminist discipline that Heide Schlüppmann established here at this university. And it's been my greatest honor to be her successor for the last 15 years. I hope I somehow managed to live up to the standard she set. Not always. We just realized that I have the decency of leaving before I stayed longer than you stayed. You were here for more than 15 years. I'm leaving shortly before my 15th year. It's a good moment to leave and let this be a sort of expression for my reverence for the work that you've been doing. And let us all hope that the spirit of cinema studies as a critical enterprise will continue and will continue to flourish in this city to which it is topical and of which it is a particular legacy. What cinema broke, only cinema can fix is the title of my talk tonight. And again, as I said, this is a film I first saw actually shortly after it came out in 1990, and I saw it only once, and it marked me for life. And then I saw it recently, screened it recently in a seminar, and it had exactly the same impact. This is one of the original posters. This is one of the reissue posters. For those who are not familiar with the storyline, I'm going to spoil it now. This is the story of an impostor, a poor man, member of the Turkish minority in one of the Turkish language minorities in Iran, a man by the name of Zabzian, who pretends to be the famous Iranian director Mohsen Makhmalbaf, introduces himself as such to a woman on a bus who happens to be reading a screenplay of Mohsen Makhmalbaf. And one thing that you need to understand, and I think it will be a recurrent theme in this lecture series, is that Iran has an incredible cinema culture. People of all walks of life and independently of their level of education do go to the cinema, and they watch Iranian films and they watch auteur films, and they venerate the directors. So it's not a star-driven cinephilia, it's a director-driven cinephilia. And so for someone to be impressed on a bus to meet Mohsen Makhmalbaf is entirely understandable. But between the two people, and this is a scene that only comes up later in the film, between the two people there is a massive difference of class, because the woman is a relatively wealthy upper middle class housemaker, homemaker as the Americans would say, but she's enthralled by this performance of the poor printer who pretends to be Mohsen Makhmalbaf, invites him to his home, and he gets to meet their family, and he pretends to be working on a new film and sort of gets them involved in the fantasy of the family participating in his next film project, and then ultimately is found out as a fraud, arrested, put in jail. And this is the moment in the linear recounting of the history when Abbas Kiarostami becomes aware of the story, because it's a fait divers. There's an article in a newspaper in Iran that tells the story of this guy who pretends to be Mohsen Makhmalbaf and is arrested by the police and put in jail. And Kiarostami was a close friend of Mohsen Makhmalbaf, reaches out to Makhmalbaf and says, I think there's a film in there somewhere. He goes to prison, talks to Zabzian. This is the original interview, which shows up in the film at some point. And then a trial is set, and it just so happens that not only the victims and the perpetrator are big fans of Makhmalbaf, but the judge is too. So the judge is a great cinephile, and he loves Makhmalbaf. And when he hears that this matter is going to go to trial, and that actually the world-famous Abbas Kiarostami wants to make a film about it and bring cameras to his courtroom and film the proceedings, he instantly says yes, because he wants to be in the film too. And he wants to meet Makhmalbaf. So everybody is just starstruck and cinephile, including the judge who you see here. The film is not told in a linear fashion. There's a there are important reenactment elements. So it's a documentary in terms of the footage shot in the courtroom and in the prison, but pretty much everything else is what is now called, in a fashionable term, a reenactment of what happened. So this is a reenactment of the bus scene. The courtroom scene is actually actual footage shot during the trial, and the scene in the upper right again is a reenactment, and then the final scene that in some of the re-releases was used for the poster is the one where he's released, where Zabzian is released from jail because he doesn't really get his sentence. Again, I'm spoiling here. And the final act of the film is that Makhmalbaf meets him as he comes out of the prison, and together they drive to meet the family, and they buy this flower on the way as sort of a gesture of reconciliation. And in the end, there is actually a sort of reconciliation. Kiarostami himself has repeatedly said that this is probably his most important film in terms of how he understands his own practice of filmmaking. It's certainly a film that has been evaluated as very important, as representative not just of Kiarostami's work, but also of that as the quintessential film of Iranian cinema. Hamid Dabashi was probably the leading cultural historian of Iran, professor at Columbia University, author of a really significant book on Shia Islam and the political history of Shia Islam, but also a great connoisseur of Iranian cinema and Palestinian cinema, by the way. Wrote this book in 2001, and as you can see, he picks the title from Kiarostami's film. The book is called Close Up Iranian Cinema, Past, Present, and Future. Kiarostami issued a note of caution early on in the film's reception because he saw that some people responded to the film in a certain way, and he had this to say: Close Up is not a film about cinema, which is what everybody was saying, and I'm going to repeat it tonight. But Kiarostami wants us not to think first and foremost of Close Up as a film about cinema and about the power and seductive power of cinema. It is a portrait of a man who is searching erratically but desperately for his place in the world. It is only because his passion, the object of his desire and the source of comfort is the cinema, that Close Up is also about the cinema. I would say, so let's remember that sentence. It's important to listen to directors, but you can't let them dictate your readings. I mean, where would we get if we left the work of criticism to artists? Humanities scholars would be out of business. And, you know, since Romanticism, the role of criticism has been to sort of tell artists what they were really trying to say. So in that spirit, I would like to argue that Close Up could be understood as a theoretical object in the sense that this term has been proposed by the French art historian Hubert Damisch, who some of you certainly know. He wrote a very important book on the perspective, on the emergence of the perspective as an artistic technique. And in an interview with his student, Yves Bois, Damisch was the supervisor of both Yves Bois, who had a career in the US, and Georges Didi Huberman, whose career he basically ruined. So Damisch is a bit of an ambivalent figure in terms of institutional history, but that's an entirely different story. We're not going to get into this tonight. But he came up with this concept of theoretical object that I've been referencing a lot, and that I think is extremely useful to describe historical objects that actually become something else. And Damisch gives this explanation in an interview he gave to Yves Bois for the American art theory, art criticism journal October, about 25 years ago, where he defines the theoretical object. So the theoretical object is a historical object that cannot be exhausted by historical explanations. A historical object, a work of art from, I don't know, the Renaissance, the 1990s, that you can say, that you can talk about in historical terms for a long time, but you will never exhaust what it does to you as a viewer, as a critic, as a potential theorist. So a theoretical object is one that obliges you to do theory. That's point one. It's one that furnishes you with the means of doing theory. So it's a work that is sort of pregnant with theoretical concepts and theoretical reflections. And it's an object that forces ourselves to think what theory is. And I would like to argue that Close Up certainly satisfies all three of those definitions of the theoretical object. So it's a film that was made in 1990, and as I will show you, it's a film that people continue to publish about. I'm just going to run four examples from the last 4 years alone. And you can do a statistical analysis. There aren't a whole lot of films made in 1990 that people still write very complex critical essays about. So that's basically criteria number one. And as we will see, and as you will see as you watch it, because it's a film that's about the question of what the power of film is, and it combines documentary and reenactment, and it sort of makes you ask questions about the power of fiction and the difference between fiction and documentary all the time. So it's a film that furnishes you with the means of doing it, and ultimately it's also a film that brings you to ask yourself, why am I thinking so hard about this damn film? Why is it that I have to come up with concepts to understand it? And as you will see in my short selection, people go on wild tangents to try and talk about the film, because it's a film that really makes you think, and in that sense also, it's a film that really makes you think about what theory is. So let me just briefly discuss 3 examples. This is from Bernard Stiegler, who passed away when? Danny, do you remember? 10 years ago, something like that. He was a student of Jacques Derrida's, deconstructivist philosopher who wrote a big 3-volume work on technique and time. He also had a prior life as a bank robber. So he's one of the few academic philosophers who has a pedigree in jail. I don't think the Frankfurt School has any of those, do they? Not that I know of. And he was a curator at the Centre Pompidou for exhibitions, but he was also a very prolific philosopher and someone who thought about cinema a lot. And so he was interested in Kiarostami, and I've spoiled the film for you by giving you an outline so that I can reference these essays here. So one of his claims here is that Close-Up stages the love of cinema. This is the first line. Stages the love of cinema by putting it on trial. So it's about cinephilia, and it's about putting cinephilia on trial. This trial is its staging, and the staging is its trial. So it's a film that stages cinephilia as a crime and puts cinephilia on trial, and that's the point for Bernard Stiegler. And then he goes on to say, one never knows which spectatorial attitude to adopt, and concludes by saying, as a whole, the film floats in a halo of indeterminations. Halo, Heiligenschein, of course, is a religious concept. So suddenly we're in the theological realm here in terms of the vocabulary. And he goes even deeper and says that a halo of indetermination that sanctify the transgression of its main character. So the main character becomes sort of a saint, a sinner who's redeemed, and there's this whole rhetoric, religious rhetoric that Stiegler develops around this particular character. But ultimately, the starting point is this is a trial for cinephilia. So just keep that in mind. This is another fairly recent and pretty wild reading. This is by Sinan Richards, and the argument here is that the film can be read as sort of a staging of the concept of the global South, and can be, again, treated as a theoretical object that helps us think through, even though it needs critical attention, the concept of the global South. So Close-Up's filmic narrative evokes the same polyvalence and slipperiness as the notion of the global South. Just throw that out there. We argue that Kiarostami's Close-Up retroactively changes Sebjan's face, and in so doing, Kiarostami's restaging actively overwrites history itself. Again, broad theoretical claim. Clearly, someone who feels empowered to write sentences like this by the film. So this is the power of the theoretical object. It really gets you to put on wings and write bold prose. And ultimately, Kiarostami adopts a strategy of infidelity as reality by using fiction to deploy a vision of the future to transform the past. Again, I'm just going to let that stand. And then the second most recent publication, the second most recent example that I would like to cite is actually from 2 area studies people in literature studies. Professors De Victor and Neuve-Église, who are specialists in Iranian culture and cinema. And their argument is that there is a culturally specific dynamic at play in the film, a subtle game of back and forth between the desire to disclose deeper meanings and the will to preserve ambiguity and intimacy, allowing for, and this is the main title of their essay, soft epiphanies. So it's a film that raises important epistemological questions, and one way of approaching it, and this is what these two authors do in a very nuanced and subtle essay, is to say, okay, there is a culturally specific way of reading this, and it's actually enabled by Kiarostami himself, who references the leading concept, and this is how we should read the film. What I'm trying to show you here is that this is a film that invites widely differing readings that and I'm not dismissing any of them at this point, that seem to have nothing to do with each other, but they're all talking about the same film, and they're confidently talking about the same film, and it's a 35-year-old film, and they're talking about it as an object that really gets you, that really forces you to produce theory in an important way. My final example is a regional local one. Danny mentioned that one of our important cooperations with the DFF has been the creation of a training program called Film Culture, Archiving, Programming, Presentation. That's it. That's the one. Which has been running since 2013, and I like to say it's very successful. Björn Schmidt is in the room. He's a graduate, and he's now a programmer here in the institution. And one of our recent students was Lotte Luley. Sorry, that's a spelling error. It should be E-E-Y. And as part of the program, our students... I'm still saying our students because it's not the end of the year. Our students go to partner institutions, many of them to the DFF, but they choose their destinations all across the world. And Lotte Luley actually went to Athens and worked there in an institution called Refocus Media Labs, and did programming work in that institution. And one of the films she took as her inspiration was actually Close Up, by Kiarostami, and she did so again for a theoretically grounded reason, which she spelled out in her Praktikumsbericht. That's the written report that our students compile when they're done with their internship term, the third semester, which they spend outside of the university in a partner institution. And in it she wrote about Kiarostami: Das Plakat nimmt Bezug auf das Filmplakat von Close Up von Abbas Kiarostami und stellte die Motorradszene mit den rosa Blumen nach. The ending of the film, as you will see. Ich werde die Referenz zu diesem Film, da er wichtige Fragen über den Charakter des Filmemachens und die Grenzen zwischen Wahrheit und Fiktion stellt. Darüber hinaus ist Close Up ein Film, der eindrucksvoll demonstriert, wozu das Kino fähig ist. Die Geschichte von Sabsian, der durch seine Lügen und Täuschungen eine tiefe emotionale Verbindung zu den Menschen herstellt, zeigt, wie Film sowohl als Mittel der Täuschung als auch als Werkzeug zur Erforschung der menschlichen Psyche dienen kann. Diese Ambivalenz macht den Film zu einem faszinierenden Anhaltspunkt, um über die ethischen und künstlerischen Dimensionen des Filmemachens nachzudenken. And I actually fully agree with that. And I want to take the rest of my remarks I want to take this thought as my starting point. So basically what she's saying is that what the film does is make us understand that film is both a medium for deceit and for the exploration of the human psyche, of deep psychological truth, and we should address and accept that ambivalence. And quite frankly, none of the authors that I quoted before gets that. I think it's really important, and she does. So this is what I want to build on. I want to tell you an anecdote from French literary history. Some people here may be familiar with the name of Maurice Blanchot, who was a French writer and critic. France, as Jean-Luc Godard likes to point out, produced the greatest art critics in the world. In Godard, it's from Diderot to Donnay. And somewhere in between, shortly before Donnet, there is Maurice Blanchot, who is a fantastic writer and a literary critic, and someone who in the 1950s militated against the French colonial war against in Algeria and against Algerians. And at one point he was became the subject of a police investigation and was called to court and had to undergo the interrogation of a juge d'instruction, a district attorney, Staatsanwalt. So there was an interrogation in court, and the juge d'instruction asked him some questions, and Blanchot gave answers, and then the judge dictated the paraphrase for the protocol. And it's part of the French process that the judge then turns to the accused and says, "Do you agree with my paraphrase?" And every single time Blanchot said, "No, this is not what I said. Let me repeat what I said." Then he reiterated his statement. Then the judge offered another paraphrase to shorten things, because Blanchot was very precise and very extensive in his answers. And the judge again offered a paraphrase, turned to Blanchot, said, "Is this okay with you?" And Blanchot, of course, said no. Until the judge, out of sheer frustration and assessing that Blanchot was probably only a minor player in the terrorist supporting networks of the FLN, decided to send him home. Dropped the case and sent him home. This is the triumph of literature over the law. There's the legal procedure. It provides an opening for the precision that is the work and handicraft of the writer, and Blanchot used it. He was just being a writer in that courtroom and basically brought justice in its formal sense to a halt by being a writer. You could say that Close-Up does something like that too. You could say that Close-Up is a film about the higher justice of cinema. It's a film that starts out, like chronologically, once you've figured out how the film works, you will understand that the very first scene is the interview in the prison. The second scene, very extensive, but it comes towards the end of the film, is the trial. And so in a way, this is also a courtroom drama documentary. Interview with the accused, with the purported criminal, and then there is a record of the criminal proceedings of the trial. But ultimately, as you will also see, there's a ruling, but the ruling is not the last word, either in the film or in the life of these characters. He doesn't go back to jail. He's ultimately released. The sentence is very mild. Again, I'm spoiling here. But the final act of the film is the thing with the flower, when he goes back to the house of the family and meets the family. And ultimately, it's about not the ruling and not about administering justice, but about reconciliation. And film is what makes this possible. Film is what gives the perpetrator the opportunity to reconcile himself with the people he was about to defraud or that he led on and seduced by proposing the fantasy that he was actually the great director Mohsen Makhmalbaf. So that's one possible reading of what we're about to see. This is a film, think of Blanchot, a film that insists on being a film and actually transcends justice and transcends the legal apparatus of state-administered law. It takes state-administered law and the criminal case as the point of departure. That's what attracted Kiarostami's attention. He read the newspaper report and mounted the project, went to talk to the criminal, and then was allowed, because the judge was a cinephile, to film in the courtroom, which is highly unusual. And so it started out as a documentary about the legal system, but it turned into something else. It turned it to its own form of justice, if you will, by offering a form of reconciliation. But there's something else, and this is what brings me back to what I think is the really deep insight of Lotte Lulay in her Praktikumsbericht. The ambivalence of cinema as something that can deceive but also restore our confidence in our ability to judge and in our ability to recognize truth. You all know this formula. Krakauer's cinema as a redemption of reality. And you probably all know how he conceives of that particular function of cinema as the redemption mainly of physical reality. Krakauer's answer to the question, Krakauer was probably the last major film theorist to ask himself whether, or to allow even, to consider the question of whether or not cinema is an art. That question has been settled at least since 1960, but in his theory of film, he still gives room to that question. And his answer is, cinema is partially an art, but films fail when there's too much art in them. You need to sort of keep art at bay. The formbildende Tendenz can only get to a certain point, because the true essence of cinema is the record of physical reality that is quite random. And so one of his famous examples is Laurence Olivier's films are really shit. Every newsreel is better than Laurence Olivier in terms of what it does as a film, because that's true cinema. Because there's physical redemption of reality in every shot in a newsreel that shows you water flowing, wind blowing through leaves, a train passing, random stuff that no director organized to be on screen, but a cameraman or a camera person just captured. So there's this very, very strong idea of cinema as a redemption of reality, which in a similar fashion can be found in Mayaderan, and it can be also found with more theological overtones than in any of those, of course, in André Bazin. But Kiarostami, I would say, and again, I'm jumping off of Lotte Lulay's idea here, Kiarostami's argument in Close-Up is that cinema is really the redemption of reality from cinema. Because cinema can be both a toxin and a cure. And in the story of Sabzian, cinema is a toxin. It is the medium of deceit. It intoxicates everyone, including the judge, by the way, to just go off into a fantasy world of believing that the guy sitting right next to you on a bus is actually Mohsen Makhmalbaf, and then the guy sitting right next to the woman on the bus making himself believe that he is Makhmalbaf, because as you will see, it's not entirely clear that he planned any of this. He just walked into it and was as seduced by the fantasy of being Makhmalbaf as were his hosts. And there was just a point when he realized that he was in deep trouble and was going to have a real hard time holding up the illusion of being Makhmalbaf. But that was because he didn't really plan the whole thing ahead. He got sucked into this by the toxin, by cinema as a toxin, if you will, as much as his victims were. But then Kiarostami and Makhmalbaf show up on scene, and they're interested in the character, and they're not judgmental. So they don't want to be judges by themselves. They certainly don't want to put him in jail. What they end up doing is create a scene of reconciliation and offering him an element of the higher justice of cinema, which sort of transcends both the moral, ethical system of judging and the legal, judicial system of judging. So this film is an example of what, in other contexts, I have been calling cinema as the last frame. When all else fails, when there is no more truth in the world, make a film. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll break for 10 minutes. So we'll be back for the film at 15:15. Then the film will start, and then we'll shoot straight from the film over to discussion with Vinzenz to talk more. There'll be plenty to talk about.
I hope the bar is still open.
All right. We have a little bit of time to chat about the film. I'm sure it's a film that raises many questions for the spectator. It's a film that, one of these films that I think it's unavoidable to come out of this film asking yourself a lot of questions. What have I just seen? What is this film? Vinzenz, I guess it's a film that really could be called an uncategorizable film, in the sense that, you kind of told us in the lecture, well, these bits are documentary and these bits are reenactments, but still there's such a question, I think, in the mind of the audience, what is reality here? What am I watching? What am I being shown? Who is performing? Who is themselves? And then of course this kind of becomes crystallized in the final scene, which you didn't spoil the final scene for us, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on that conclusion to the film.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm sort of puzzled by all the people who say that it's very confusing, and like Bernard Stiegler, who says you don't know which spectatorial attitude to adopt. We now have this very popular concept of reenactment, which gives us a handle of what's happening here. But the film explains its procedures all the time. And, there's a key scene in court where Sapsion is asked by the judge, and they're basically talking about acting theories. And the judge is a really interesting character. There's this one little close-up that Kiarostami catches to characterize him, where he's smiling, and he's just impressed with the craft, but also with the boldness of the character, and he's sort of fascinated with the guy, but. Basically, Sapsion says, in conventional terms, he says, "Well, I'm not a Diderot scholar, a Diderot actor. I'm a method actor, because I become the character, and when I'm there, I'm actually Makhmalbaf. I know I'm not Makhmalbaf, but it feels like it." And the way, the film is really well structured and very well edited, and that comes at a point in the film when the big reenactment scenes, the arrest and all of that, comes after that. And to my mind, it gives you a clue as to how to read these performances. They're all like that. They love acting. They love being the characters in the film that they were in real life before. And even after I'd seen it the first time in maybe 1991 at the Locarno Film Festival, to me it's been pretty transparent what's going on. I don't get the whole thing about the epistemological confusion, because the film so clearly marks out how that works, and how all of these people, for various reasons, are seduced into their performance and into this shared fantasy. That's the greatness of the film itself, and what it has to say about cinema is that this is a group of people who are completely seduced by the shared fantasy of being in a film, and so they're all innocent in a way. And they're all guilty.
He's kind of saying no one is immune from being seduced by the cinema in the end.
Yeah,
it seduces
absolutely.
us all. No one can resist that.
Yeah. You can go on, and I carefully, except for citing this really smart essay by the two French professors of Iranian studies, I've stayed away from veering off into culturalist explanations of what's going on. And I recommend anything and everything that Hamid Dabashi has ever written about Iran and Iranian cinema in particular, but particularly the book about Shia Islam could be interesting. The Hidden Prophet, and the waiting for the hidden prophet to come back, the expectation that one day the hidden prophet will knock on your door and universal justice will reign. So there are some spiritual and religious notions that are specific to the cultural context and to Shia Islam embedded in the film, but the film works even if you don't get that. It's very much, I mean, what is puzzling and what makes it so fascinating as a cultural object is to see that there is this historical moment, this cultural situation, Iran in the 1980s, where cinema does have this extremely seductive power. And it's for various reasons. For the sons in the family, it's that they got their university degrees and they're highly qualified and they should be getting jobs, but the country is in a permanent economic crisis. And so there's the situation where the older son is managing a bread factory and the younger son says, well, he's selling bread. And then the mother says, that's not true, he's managing a bread factory. But they have this kind of ambition that gets them to veer off into the cinema. For Sobzyan, it's just pure hunger. As he says at one point, the reason why he started to put on the performance was that he was thinking, well, maybe I can get a free lunch out of this. Maybe I can get to the family and get some food, and then he gets sucked into the whole performance, and he realizes he didn't prepare well enough. He should have read all those magazines. He should have known about the stupid award at the Rimini Festival, and his performance just falls apart. But the suggestive power of cinema for all of these people, for various reasons, is so strong. And it's very hard to think of another cultural context where that could happen in the same way. And around the director, who by Western standards would be seen as an auteur. Maybe Bengal. Maybe somebody passing himself off as Ritwik Ghatak or Satyajit Ray could get away with this for a few days in the suburbs of Kolkata. But I can't think of any other place in the world where that's possible. But it's easy to understand what's going on still. And again, I don't buy the whole epistemological crisis, we don't know what's going on thing. It's very clear what's going on.
The irony is that Sobzyan, you say he's motivated by hunger, like for food.
That's what he says. Yeah.
But he also there seems to be some deeper hunger that's motivating him for recognition, maybe, or like a kind of status or something. It's also important to note that he's a minority. Mm-hmm. He's a very poor Turkish-speaking minority from the Northwest. So there's a social status issue, and the family also is bilingual. So there's this moment when Kiarostami says, "Please talk Farsi because we're recording this, and don't limit our audience." But what I wanted to ask is, the irony is, he got his wish in a way, or his fantasy has been realized, because we're sitting here 35 years later in Frankfurt, we're watching Sobzyan on the screen, and he really is like a very absorbing character. You really, I think, emote with him on a very strong level, I would say. He's kind of ironic, this historical irony that this fantasy has been fulfilled in the end. Yeah,
that's sort of what I was trying to get at with by borrowing Lotte Loulet's thought about the ambivalence of cinema and cinema as the redemption of reality from cinema, and he sort of makes it to his experience is given a form that transcends that particular moment. And in the end, the wonderful line of Makhmalbaf when he rings the doorbell. This is like the hidden prophet coming back moment. He rings the doorbell and he says, "So this is Sobzyan. He's a new acquaintance for you now," and so he is for us, and he stays with us,
Message to the students out there, though: you'll never know when your Praktikumsbericht will be quoted in a public arena.
We just have very smart students. That's what I'm trying to say.
Nice to flatter your students when you're about to leave the department. We have a roving mic. Björn, maybe we can get some questions. Yes, Shirin.
I was wondering, last time when we saw Taste of Cherry, Daniel, you told us that the scenes that we see in the car with Mr. Buddy, the dialogue scenes, they weren't actually filmed with the two actors present. And you said that a lot of actors didn't ever meet in real life. I know in this film it's a bit different, otherwise they wouldn't be in court together if they hadn't met in real life. But I was wondering about the reenactment scenes that we see in the bus with Mrs. Orhanjo and Mr. Sabzion, if they actually were present together while filming this, or if you could tell, if any of you could tell.
There's no reason to doubt that. Yeah, I mean they all played along and restaged that. Frankly, part of the reason why I'm objecting so much to something like Stiegler's claim about the blurring of boundaries and we don't know what's happening, that's Orientalism. It's just, these irrational Iranians, you never know. I think it's very clear that they agreed to restage that scene. And the answer that he gives in court, where he says, well, I just became the character and it was pleasurable for me to be the character, and when in the evening I left, I sort of felt sad leaving the character behind, and I came back because it was so great to be the character. I think he expresses something that the other people in the film who play themselves also experience when they get back into that moment and into that role. I think it's a testament to their generosity and ability to reconcile themselves with what they went through, that they're willing and able to perform that way. By the way, the mother is my favorite character in the film. She's very. She's an incredibly beautiful woman, but also very sad and marked by life. And this is the most interesting face in the film for me. And she's the trigger. She's the hinge. On her reaction, the whole story hinges. But from all we know, they agreed to reenact that and did a good job of it. I mean, that's the other thing you have to say. They're pretty good at restaging an experience that could potentially be humiliating for them, for the camera. It also says something about the quality of the director to create a situation of confidence where they're willing to do that. And we get some glimpse of the explanatory work he does in trying to explain to them what he's proposing for them to do. There's the moment, the first interaction with the father of the family, where the father says, yeah, everybody who's talked to us about the story has tried to get something for themselves out of it, and they try to position themselves as the person who ends up looking good. Now you come and you have this project, and I don't really get what you're trying to do. And so that suggests that Kiarostami came in and said, look, I know what happened. I read the article. The article was my trigger. Here's what we try to do. Would you be willing to get along? And then there's in a way there's a gap, because we don't have the full answer he's giving to the father. To explain to him what's going on. But that's very early in the film, and the father asks that question, and if the answer had not been good, the film wouldn't have existed. So I think this is in a way, so he edits out his virtuoso directing and lets them shine in their reenactment performances, which he clearly managed to set up in a way to make them as plausible as they are in the film, and as, let's say, unhurtful to the participants as they are, because they're in a vulnerable position. I mean, the incredibly touching ethical achievement of Kiarostami's direction in this film is to not make these people look stupid in the reenactment. To take them seriously and to give them the space where everybody can revisit their seduction in a way that is dignified and ultimately, even though it's a reenactment and the play is transparent, you know. So that's it's a very those are layered performances because they are Brechtian in the way that everybody knows what they're doing, but they're also getting back into character and they're living the situation. So they're not making any signs of I'm playing myself now, I'm being fooled by the guy on the bus. But they're going back to revisit the original emotion, and it's really a testament to the outstanding quality of the director that he gets them to go there and capture that on camera and make them look good while they're doing it. Is that a useful response to? Yeah.
Vinzenz, if I could gently push on one element, though. I mean, you say, okay, there's documentary scenes, there's reenactments. There's a material signifier of that too, because the court case scenes, they look 16 millimeter.
Yeah, in terms of quality, they're poorer.
So we can kind of see the image, like the image tells us, okay, that was filmed under certain circumstances.
Limited. There's one camera position, and he has to go in a place in the courtroom, which must have been agreed on with the judge and arranged with the judge, where he has everyone in his sight. Yeah. And then the whole group is there. It's like a sort of a Rembrandt group portrait. And then he can pick them out and zoom in. And there's this wonderful moment where he goes for a close-up of the mother.
The mother of Sabzian.
Yeah. No. I mean, Sabzian's mother is a really important character. But earlier, okay, he anchors the whole proceedings by going in on the family, on the family matriarch.
Yeah. The one, I mean, where I still ask myself questions is, let's take the opening scene, essentially. They're in the car. It's a journalist, a taxi driver, the two soldiers.
My friend Oriana Fallaci.
Yeah, but, I'm great pals with all these great journalists. But, I mean, these are questions that I'm like, are the soldiers reenacting themselves? You know, who's doing the taxi driver? Like the guy on the side of the road with the turkeys? I mean, who is playing what? Who is just themselves? Who is playing something totally different? The journalist himself is like this weird slapstick figure in the film, like, is like running around looking for. First of all, you're a journalist. What's the one cardinal sin you should never make as a journalist is to forget your tape recorder.
Yeah.
But that's for me is why they're also there. I get what you're saying, but for me there are always so many questions about this film. Like, what am I watching and what am I supposed to be ascribing to this film? That's still like.
I mean, judging by the courtroom footage, the journalist plays himself. We don't know about the other characters in the taxi scene. And, I mean, the taxi scene, if you will, is... that's the one that sort of seems carefully scripted because there is a message that he wants to get across. This guy is sort of full of himself and is clearly... thinking of himself as a journalist on par with people like Oriana Fallaci. Does anyone of the younger people in the room still know who Oriana Fallaci is? Yeah, I was guessing that you would know.
She's not someone you really want to be identified with. I would say, given what she did later.
I think it depends on the stages of her career. So Oriana Fallaci was this celebrity Italian journalist from the 1960s. She's actually in Pasolini's documentary on sex in Italy,
Comizi d'amore.
Comizi d'amore. She's one of the people he interviews, and so she was this sort of feminist celebrity journalist who then later in life weared off into slightly odd terrain. We don't have those kinds of celebrity journalists anymore. I think the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, the one where the Americans invaded Iraq in 1991, was the last one where you had these celebrity journalists promoted by CNN. Christian Amanpour is like the last surviving version of Oriana Fallaci. But there were a thing in the 70s and 80s. You had these celebrity journalists. They were basically Tintin, but going to actual war zones. And Falaci did things like interviewing Gaddafi when that was not done, and stuff like that. And so there were pop cultural phenomena, and this guy sitting in the taxi clearly, just like Zabzian thinks of himself as Makhmalbaf thinks of himself as somebody who would be good friends with Oriana Falaci, which he clearly isn't because he doesn't have a damn tape recorder. He forgot to bring a tape recorder to the biggest story of his life. Which is not a good look. But the scene also serves to, I mean, the key moment is where he asks the cab driver whether he knows who Makhmalbaf is. And the cab driver said, well, he was never a fare. He was never a passenger in my cab. Which is a great answer. I would know him if he'd taken my cab. But it's very much, I mean, this is about class. But at the same time, it's also about saying that cinema's appeal cuts across class in Iran, in post-revolutionary Iran, because Sabzian is clearly of a very different socioeconomic and ethnic status than the family he lures into his fantasy. Yeah.
Further questions? Yeah, yes, over here. Björn.
Okay. The translation was a bit jumpy at some points, but what I think is like very interesting is that the way Sabzian is talking is very distinctive, and it's very like interesting to hear how self-conscious he is through the whole way through the movie. Like those moments where he was like recorded and then the reenactment, it's like you barely notice that there's a difference. And I wonder, how often do you actually meet actors who are so self-conscious and who are able to reenact their own feelings in certain moments that well? So I think that is like something that is very interesting.
Thanks for that observation. I mean, you're talking to ignorant people here. That's the kind of nuance you only get if you speak Farsi and can judge that kind of performance. But so I'm going to throw something out there and ask you to respond to it. I would guess him being a film fan and being someone who goes to the movies a lot and clearly spends a lot of time thinking about film, and also having a lot of time on his hands to do so, will probably have thought about what it means to be a performer, and will probably have worked on his performance. So he didn't come into this a complete amateur, would be my guess. There's this. There are all these YouTube clips about actors talking about famous moments on set with celebrity actors, and there's one clip going around of Kevin Pollak talking about Jack Nicholson on the set of A Few Good Men. There's this famous scene that builds up towards the confession of Jack Nicholson, where he says, well, you can't handle the truth, and then he basically gives away the game. And apparently, they were on set all day, and Nicholson was on the stand all day, and they shot reaction shots and shot the other parts. And they repeated that scene maybe 20 times. And what Kevin Pollak reports is that Nicholson played the same performance, delivered the same performance every single time, whether he was on camera or not. And so it depends on the actor and of the professionalism of the actor. And one of the responses of Nicholson was, well, this is my job and I love doing it. But it's just a level of technical proficiency that some actors do have. Not all of them. We know that Rock Hudson, after the seventh take, you could forget about him, and Marilyn Monroe needed 20 takes, and she was all over the place, but not Jack Nicholson. Yeah, and so it's sort of to be expected by someone who takes cinema very, very seriously and thinks about. I mean, this guy thinks about what it means to incarnate the character. The response he gives to the judge is actually very nuanced and very articulate. And so I don't find it surprising that there is very little difference between the testimony in court, also a very formal setting, and then the reenactment, because there is an element, even though he's a complete amateur, of aspirational quasi-professionalism. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
There was Deleuze came up with a category of actor. He said there are, we all know there are professional actors and then non-professional actors, and then he came up with a new category which was professional non-actors. And he was like Jean-Pierre Léaud, Anna Karina, so like people who are their profession is like not to be acting, but to just kind of like be on the screen.
Yeah, but I think this is different, right? What you're describing is someone who has actually has technique.
Yeah.
And who acquired a certain technique just by thinking about it and by going through the fantasy and then being able to respond to the professional settings that he's in. I mean, being in court is no cakewalk.
Being in court is also a kind of performance, right?
It is totally a performance.
He has to be acting not just for the camera, but for the judge.
Yeah.
His life is in the judge's
everybody's
hands,
in role play. But,
yeah.
I mean...
the judge is performing too, very clearly, like what you were saying. Like, the judge is very happy to be kind of like playing the role.
No, I mean, there's an element of role play, but I don't think what you're trying to get at, and we must trust you as the informant who speaks Farsi, that he, in terms of how he expresses himself, he's very, very conscious of being in a role play situation, and I don't think that is what Deleuze means when he talks about Léaud, where he basically says, Léaud, you turn on the camera and just let him do his thing. And it works because he's photogenic or a natural talent or the camera loves him, whatever the American terms are for this. This seems to be very different. Yeah, okay.
More questions? Yes, right at the back here, Karina.
I don't know how to best say this, but I kept wondering if there is no safe space to act out dreams as being a creator or being in filmmaking other than going to this extreme notion of impersonating someone. I mean, like, if I put myself in his position, I would dream about it, maybe journal about it, or talk to my friends about it, but not go to such extremes. So I was wondering if there's just no safe space in Iran.
I'm tempted to ask, have you ever been this hungry?
Probably not.
Yeah.
But is it also, if I can piggyback on this question, to be a film...
I'm still thinking about the question, but my first response would be what he does, even though, again, I think we can all understand what's going on in the film without bringing in too much cultural specificity arguments. But there is, Iran is a relatively wealthy country because of the oil and educational levels and all of that. So it's one of the countries that attracts migrant workers from neighboring states, particularly Pakistan, but also Afghanistan, because it's much wealthier than its neighbors. But the Iranian Revolution was, to an important extent, a proletarian revolution. It was poor people seeking a revolution, and then the big disappointment of the left was that it was driven by faith rather than an understanding of historical materialism. And but it was a popular revolution, and it was driven by popular resentment against an exploitative elite and against the neo-colonial encroachment of the extractive industries covered by the Americans and the British, which was also, by the way, part of the reason why Mossadegh was toppled in Iran had a democratically elected government and has a long tradition of democratic governance. Actually, it had a democratically elected government in 1953, and Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, took it away from the British, and said, "Okay, that money's going to be ours now." And initially, the Americans backed Mossadegh. Truman was sort of American enough to still hate the British enough to let him get away with it, to put it in blunt terms. And then the Cold War framing took over. And when Eisenhower became president, basically the CIA stepped in and toppled the government and installed the Shah. Partly to reestablish control over the nationalized oil industry, but also in order to, because this was a sort of a frontier state, it shared a border with the Soviet Union, in order to establish a client regime that they could control and that would be a safe ally in the fight against the Soviet Union. And then when the revolution happened, the Soviets, of course, hoped that it would become a socialist revolution, that they could gain influence there. But that is not what happened. What happened was a popular revolution driven by faith and by the energy of Shia Islam in particular. And so there was still, even though it's a comparatively very wealthy country in the region, there was still a lot of poverty. And I ask that question somewhat bluntly because I think the hunger argument is pretty real. Even somebody who had a job, who was able to form a family, would go for days on end without properly eating, and that also gives you the kind of energy that leads you to not write a diary or talk to your friends about it, but actually stage the whole thing. Yeah.
My question was actual filmmakers are basically also 90% of the time scam artists, right? They're trying to get money out of people, like for their films, invest in my film, knowing full well they'll never get their money back, be an actor in my film. I mean, this is like, a lot of it is bluff. There's a fine line that separates what we see in Sabzian from like what filmmakers like Kiarostami and Makhmalbaf actually have to do to get their films made, right? I mean, in a sense, that's, for me, why Kiarostami, most people would say, oh, like, this guy's, like, impersonating you or a close friend of yours, like, stay the hell away from him, make sure you don't come into contact with him. And Kiarostami does the exact opposite thing. But in the sense that he feels like a weak connection with Sabzian.
Yeah, I mean, without a certain degree of empathy and of understanding of what drives the character, I don't think he would have been interested. Totally agree with you, and I also don't think, I'm coming back to what I think is really a key scene of the film, where the father asks, "What the hell is this project? What are you getting out of it?" And the answer must have been really smart, and the answer was based in an empathy for everybody involved. So he was clearly capable of making everybody understand what the project was to get this out of it. This could have gone off the rails in so many ways so very, very quickly. So an element of recognition must have been there, but also an element of reflexive recognition, of someone understanding what the situation was and how putting on a show like this is actually like filmmaking, only without the money and the cameras. You wanted to follow up?
All right, yeah. Maybe, yeah, okay, sure.
No, I just wanted to add to the question that was posed before. Unfortunately, not everything was captured in the captions in the movie, but...
It's the sad reality of subtitles. They're always reductive.
Is, unfortunately, but I think there was like one thing that I thought was really important that wasn't captured in the captions was when they were in court and they were talking about how I think it was Mehraj who gave Sabzion money for a taxi or for a cab and to buy something, and then Sabzion said, I wanted to, like for once I wanted to buy a bag of chips for my child. Yes. And that wasn't captured in a caption, but I think that was also a key sentence.
Yeah, I mean that's his justification. I mean, if in some of the critical essays about the film or reviews, that is pointed out that he uses that argument. You could say excuse. I mean, his task in the trial situation is to convince the judge that he had no plan of defrauding these people, that he wasn't entering their house to plan a robbery, and that he had no interest in actually robbing them of any money. But in this particular situation, he thinks, okay, I have the money now. I can do something for my kid who, we know he has two of them, and one of them lives with his mother and the other one lives with the kid's mother. So he's a father of two children who doesn't really have a working relationship with either one of them. Also, simply because he can't provide. I mean, that's the story of how the marriage ended. He wasn't capable of sustaining the family, and then I mean the question there will be, does he put that notion out in front of the judge strategically to convince the judge, or is it a real story? Is it just a way of making himself look vulnerable, innocuous, a caring father in need, or does he understand the situation that he's in, and he knows that he has to pull this lever in order to get away with the non-sentence that he's ultimately getting? But it's an important point. Yes, I mean I'm guessing that in the subtitling they decided to focus just on the description of the basic family situation. But yeah, I mean, it's just the sad truth is subtitles are always super reductive.
So we have time for maybe one last question.
This is why it's great we have so many Farsi speakers in the room, so that we get a better understanding of what's really going on.
Regarding this money that he borrowed, he also mentioned that, I don't know if it was before or during this explanation, he said it was hard to be Makhmalbaf again in that time. And I think it was actually explaining why he got the money, not for the poverty reasons, but maybe to not have this concern of poverty, so that he can play a director, he can stay in the role or in this escape story that he created for himself. Because if he worries about a bag of chips for his kid, then he cannot be Makhmalbaf anymore. It was, interesting how he put it there.
Yeah, just follow up on that. One interesting telling detail in the whole narrative is who owns a car and who doesn't. And in the bus scene, one of the first questions the woman asks is, so you're Makhmalbaf and you're on this bus. I thought successful directors owned cars. And then later you realize, I mean, this is a relatively wealthy family. That's a big house. And they have an expensive stereo set, for instance. And one of the sons owns a motorcycle, but they don't have a car. And so there are, layers, and whether ultimately Makhmalbaf shows up on a motorcycle, not in a car. So he's probably just motorcycle level successful and not car level successful. But there's a popular fantasy out there that he should own a car, and it gives you a sense of just what status symbol and what level of wealth that is. And understand that this is a country that has a lot of natural resources and oil. So you would expect people to drive a lot more cars than we're actually seeing. Maybe 20 years later, everyone has a car, but not in this particular moment. And so he doesn't want them. Only in the court situation can he admit safely, that he uses the money to buy chips for his son, because Makhmalbaf would never be in a situation like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yes,
all right, maybe
please.
one very, very quick final question before we all call it a night.
It's just, sorry, just reconnecting, because I was thinking a lot about the omelette in the arresting scene, and it's just more to, it's not a question, but I think that was not only a moment of the shared empathy, but it was like, this time watching the mother was also one of my favorite moments in the film, and particularly the omelette scene, when she, like in the reenacted scene of the arrest, and they're having like the conversation about the omelette before. I can make you a quick omelette if you want, and she's like, when he leaves, like there's a moment of true care of this mother for this person, I would say. Also hearing you talk about the whole poverty and hunger, I just want to stress that I was thinking a lot about the omelette and how she says, but let him have his omelette.
So
before.
I'm going to pick up on that, and just very briefly, and ask this as a question of the cultural informants in the room. I read this scene as being about the sanctity of hospitality. So even though they suspect that he's a fraud, there is no way that they're going to deny him a meal if and when he's in their house. Like if he asks for food, they're obliged to serve him food, even if what he's doing is in a way a breach of hospitality. But it can't be them denying it. Is that a correct reading? Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, maybe we'll end on that note. First of all, we'll be back next week for our subsequent installment in Kiarostami Lecture and Film. We'll be watching First Case, Second Case, and Disorderly and Orderly, two earlier films in Kiarostami's work from the kind of immediate post-revolutionary period, actually. And Matthias Wittmann, a scholar of Iranian cinema, will be helping us kind of navigate those two films. But finally, I just want to say something. Australians have this tendency to, even if you know you're never going to see someone again, you're absolutely certain of it, they just say, see you later, when you say goodbye to someone. But Vinzenz, I'm certain we'll see you again. So I think right now, not saying, branding this as a farewell lecture, but this is a see you later lecture. I think we'll definitely see you later. So see you later, Vinzenz.
I'm definitely not moving to Australia.